evening. My name is Anvisha. I work at Hasgeek, and today's session has been organized under the fifth elephant. The session today is about data governance practices in the account aggregator ecosystem. The account aggregator ecosystem is vital for modernizing financial services by enabling secure and efficient data sharing between institutions and consumers. It promotes financial inclusion, facilitates innovative products, and ensures data security, privacy, and transparency. In today's session, Mr. Vamsi Madhav, the CEO at DigiSahamati Foundation, will be talking about data governance practices in the AA ecosystem. The session is going to be in an Ask Me Anything format, and participants are encouraged to think about questions and ask them either over chat or by raising the hand on Zoom. We're also being live streamed on YouTube, so you can drop questions on there as well. And the conversation will be a free-flowing one, and you can make sure to ask any questions you may have on data governance and best practices for the same. Over to you, Mr. Vamsi.
Thank you, Anvisha. Just a quick sound check. I hope I'm audible. If you could just,
Yeah.
okay, lovely. And yes, I do wish this is interactive, but I realize that what that implies is a dependence on you to sort of guide me from time to time on what questions may come in through the YouTube channel and so on and so forth, as well as point my attention to any questions in chat that I may have missed out. Could you help me with that a little bit? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, lovely. So thanks again, Anvisha. Thanks also to the Hasgeek folks and communities under various subgroups that you listed for this opportunity. A quick sort of topical introduction to myself. It's to the day a little over 5 years that I've had the opportunity to sort of immerse myself in what's called account aggregator ecosystem. The fundamental motivation behind this ecosystem being born was to give agency to all of us as quote unquote owners of our own data in the decisions that we typically make. Those decisions are whom to give our data, how much to give, and how to remain in control of overturning a decision to give or revoking what's called consent. And the philosophy behind this sort of techno-legal thinking was to invert what clearly we've all experienced as a not very healthy consequence of the way the internet or Web 2 has evolved, where we are both the producers of content but also the products, in the same vein. And in the last few years, we've seen the increased vigilance that regulators and civil society has sort of brought to the fore on reclaiming our right to privacy and reclaiming our right to freedom and agency over where our data goes and how our data goes. And the account aggregator ecosystem is the sort of the Indian response to that problem. And it's a techno-legal response, which means that it carries with itself two facets as standards. One is legal dimension, and thanks to the DPDP Act, which has come into existence, that sort of completes the stack of regulations this that party control of the users to experience as the uh, protocol so guarantee uh, uh, needs to do and employs a principle of minimalism. And it also standardizes the data format itself, because one of the issues so far has been that, you know, data has always been shared by us in a variety of ways, but we do not know the costs that such data sharing has entailed. And often those costs are sort of trickled down to all of us as end users, and therefore cost of financial services, reach of financial services is sort of a negative function of of the technical architecture. So by standardizing the format and the protocol of such things, it does ensure that the costs come down. Just give me a minute. So with that said, I've also sort of where the ecosystem is at. What's what that means are actually uh, uh, to look low and look at advisors to explain yeah, or one or hundred of these that are so these insurance companies, asset management companies, GSTN, and so on and so forth. And the remaining 300 are recipients of the data. So these are NBFCs, banks again the insurance companies, stockbrokers, and so on and so forth. So the ecosystem has come to a point where I think one can safely say it has crossed the 0 to 1 threshold. It has sort of proven its value. It has sort of proven its ability to and be stable, but clearly we are in the 1 to 10 phase, and that's where there is a lot of work to be done. Now, I will pause here with a quick reminder to myself and to the rest of us that what we are here to discuss in this is sort of go a little deeper into data governance, and that's a term that we may have to define a little bit and separate out what account aggregator as an ecosystem promises and what it doesn't promise. That's where I will start. But really, what to do is just to see for a minute if there are people who may be able to help me frame some questions that they'd like me to respond to in whichever format, and that gives some direction to what I may be able to then spend the rest of the 50 minutes here on. Has anything popped in yet, Anvesha, to your notice?
No, not yet. Ambika, if you have any questions, since you're on Zoom, feel free to go ahead. Otherwise, perhaps we could start with maybe trying to define the data governance and as what it stands currently in the ecosystem and also generally in the industry. Ambika, if you have any questions.
Okay, I think we will just get started with me trying to sort of pick up from what you mentioned, Anvesha. Let's get into understanding what are the risks that a customer today, let's forget account aggregator for a second, and let's look at what are the risks that a customer today or a citizen today, I tend to use the word customer because we have a very sort of corporate context, but citizen also has a very political context. So I'll keep splitting between the two. But a user of a financial service, let's go individual or a legal entity such as a corporate, the risk when it comes to that, first, risk of uh, corporate reputation, which means that we are that my well known for the me. I carry that is really going to change as this user change, right? So that's risk one. The second risk is typically financial end users are vulnerable to some sort of emotional stress at the time they're seeking a financial service. I mean, if I want a loan, that's obviously because I don't have enough money. So I'm emotionally vulnerable. If I want a financial advisory service, I'm probably looking at getting my house in order. So there is some amount of stress. And in that moment of stress, how do I really know if what is being sought as my data is indeed limited for the purpose that I'm being asked for it? So that in typical terms is called collection limitation. And if, how do I know if what is being collected is indeed limited, right, to the purpose stated? The third risk is what in classic European terms has been called storage limitation, which is essentially the time duration that my data is going to be looked at. I mean, that's essentially the permission I have given, which is for a certain limited amount of time, please go ahead and know more about me through my data and then decide if you like me or not. I mean, that's effectively what a lot of the data sharing purposes end up being. It's about presenting my bona fides and asserting my rights to a financial service in a professional context. And therefore, I'm okay somebody coming and peeking into my data, but I'm okay for a limited period of time. And what I'm definitely interested in knowing is whether after that period of time, the data is indeed going to be erased, so to speak, right, from wherever it's gone. And that's called storage limitation, in typical terms. So one way to frame the risks that a customer has is in terms of these limitations, right? The other risks that customers have is simply inconvenience or non-availability of of elaborate sort of in terms of confidentiality, integrity, but also availability. And what that implies is that security or anything that ring fences the risks or mitigates the risks to a customer must not go the other extreme where it effectively becomes non-available to a customer to use in the first place, right? And so a lot of the current processes that may exist to protect me as a customer may also make it terribly inconvenient. As a case in point, if I really need to give my data to a certain end user today, we have more than one financial account. We at least have a bank account, we have a fixed deposit somewhere, we have a insurance perhaps, and so on and so forth. So it is quite inconvenient for me to go getting all of that information because I have to go to each of those financial institutions. Everyone has their proprietary channels. Everyone has their, two factors of authentication. And so the act of just me accessing my own data is often made very inconvenient behind well-intentioned but arduous, processes that are meant to protect my sort of digital security, right? So if you look at it, there is a swing between either a risk of sort of errant data usage on the one hand, or on the other hand, there's a risk of extreme inconvenience and a lot of security-driven walls that I have to cross to get my data, right? And what the account aggregator ecosystem or the concept does is try to find a mid path, right? How does it find a mid path? Let's first speak about the first set of risks, right? In order to, as a very first level gate, ensure that recipients of data act in a responsible fashion, right? The very simple technique is to ensure that those recipients make it easy for a customer to understand what the data is being asked for, to understand all the parameters that will be employed while processing the data, and to make a declaration to the customer as to how that recipient will responsibly not use the data after a certain period of time. Right? Now, this simple technique of transparency is also what is codified in the DPDP Act as what's called a notice that has to be given to a data principal. And recipients of data who define the purpose and means of processing data are called data fiduciaries. So the term fiduciary essentially means duty of care, right? So in other words, if you make it technically mandatory for a data fiduciary to exhibit or assert their duty of care through an electronic mechanism to customers, in other words, show an electronic notice that effectively has a set of parameters that defines the purpose, that defines the collection parameters in terms of, what is the data being sought, how many times will the data be fetched, and then also has what's called data life, which is essentially how long will the data be kept, and will it be sort of that's my hand itself. Okay, and will it be sort of erased or at least not processed beyond the purpose? That is step one. And so what the account aggregator network does as one technical concept aiding in better governance or risk mitigation of usage of my data is it codifies the concept of electronic consent. And it fundamentally borrows from an artifact that the Ministry of Electronics and IT had put out, I think, way back in 2015 or 16. RBI essentially adopted that concept of an electronic consent, which is a very simple act of taking a physical paper consent, deconstructing the attributes of it and codifying that as sort of a digital public good, if you will, which is essentially a specification for data, 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 all of it. Make it what they are digital conversation. Also they are educated multi right? Digital, there are so often there are which is a mix of things, right? But it has a kiosk, and that's sort of a digital mechanism of interacting. But for a second, let's assume that we are largely talking about the digital context, because that's where a lot of these risks get amplified, right? I mean, physical environments, the risks have other ways of getting mitigated. So in a digital context, will the data fiduciary be the one that is sort of presenting consent by following this sort of spec, but using their own design constructs? Or is there a better way? Now, what's wrong with every data fiduciary presenting it on their own interfaces according to their own designs? Well, what's wrong is the concept of a vested interest. Accidentally and often willfully, and this is one of the data governance risks, which is that you cannot on modern day data fiduciaries to be extremely rigorous in limiting the amount of data they're collecting, because most digital businesses today depend upon building a profile over a period of time of each one of us. Even responsible fiduciaries do want to do so. And it's a constant sort of tussle that I have been engaged in the last few years in trying to find the mid path between acknowledging that often it is for the benefit of customers that producers of goods should know more about me. I mean, there's nothing fundamentally wrong about that, because it often leads to a very tailored experience. It may lead to a lot of benefit for me, but it carries with it the other risk that maybe somebody will get carried away there and very insidiously start seeking a little more than what is actually required, right? So that's risk number one. Risk number two is that the manner in which these attributes are presented to me may often be through a dark UX pattern, right? And there's great work being done on dark UX patterns these days, and there's a lot of regulation coming out. And that's because the most well-intentioned minds, and I've been in the product management space for a while to say this with some authority, that when we somehow design interfaces, we forget the fact that we ourselves are customers. We have a very insidious Dr. Jekyll that we play, where we are customers during the weekend, but we are producers during the week. And we tend to forget that, our actions, can sometimes be sort of misplaced. We ourselves wouldn't like it if we were the other receiving end. So we design UX patterns in a way where we want to nudge customers towards a certain intention. And obviously, as a fiduciary, I never want the customer to not give me consent, right? I mean, why will I ever be so open to say, oh, well, if you want to reject my request, please go ahead and reject it, et cetera, et cetera. So there are good reasons, digital design reasons, to think of alternatives. And that's the second thing that the account aggregator ecosystem did, which is said, not only will we standardize the parameters of an electronic consent, we will also take the control away from the fiduciaries in terms of presenting that consent and guiding the end users in a very neutral fashion as to how to give informed consent and how to give free and specific and explicit consent, right? And thus was born the concept of a new class of entities that carry within the only charter of managing consents of and for data principles, which is you and I as customers and citizens. Now, this is a very interesting concept. Would like to spend a minute, because you could have two alternatives here. You could have either the alternative of control going to the custodians. So why not have a mechanism in which it's not the recipient of data that is seeking my consent, but it is the custodian of my data that seeks my consent before sharing it with anybody else, right? So in other words, if I am looking for a loan, it could either be the lender that asks for my consent, which we have now discussed and said, well, that's a bad idea because of the reasons I mentioned. And therefore, one could argue it could the of uploading my that's make a total stop uh, and would like to a lender, right? And they do have a vested interest in not letting me go elsewhere, in not letting me shop around for the best offer that I could potentially get. Uh, so therefore, actually, it's perhaps a bad idea to let my bank know that I'm actually looking for a very specific type of financial service, but that I'm looking elsewhere, because then I'll be hounded by my own bank, for example. And I'm just saying bank as the most obvious example that may come to our mind, but this is true for any other financial institution. This is true of an insurer, it's true of an asset management company. Anybody that has a financial service to offer would like to build a relationship with me, and therefore would perhaps very grudgingly sort of design the way for me to give consent and invest in all that infrastructure, right? So therefore, the whole idea was to neither look at the recipient of data nor look at the provider of the data, the custodian of data, and and therefore do something else. Now, what is that something else? Now, you could have a model, which I believe is a model followed in Singapore, where it becomes a government-owned central system, which is taking the consent from all the customers and sort of, orchestrating the flow. Now, for obvious reasons, that's not a great idea for a large country like India. Centralization of any such sensitive behavioral information in a single location would obviously lead to a lot of issues. And we've learned, in the last decade or so, we've learned from our own rollouts on digital public infrastructure as to what are the good things and what are not the good things for us to do. So that fundamentally leaves us with one option, and the only option, which is to sort of follow what UPI has done. It was a concept actually born a little ahead of AA and obviously ramped up and scaled up. We know that story, where UPI has essentially delinked the act of storing the data, in that case it's money, and the act of making the money flow from the act of consent for money to be sort of sent either to a merchant or to another player, right? And the TPAPs, as they're called, the third-party apps, like the phone pays and the Google pays, are essentially not handlers of money. They are only, in many ways, user interface providers that allow the customers to give consent for the act of giving payment. And so that pattern was followed, and therefore what followed is essentially the act of licensing a new class of entities called account aggregators, whose job would now be to present the consent request or the notice that a data fiduciary wants the customer to see, or the data principal to see, but also manage the interactions that the data principal then would do upon seeing the notice, in terms of either approving that request or rejecting it, or subsequently revoking a consent given. And then once you've licensed out a new class of entities who are neutral, that effectively means they are meant of the data principles themselves. They are not meant to be philosophically, at least, if not economically, they are philosophically, their North Star is meant to be to protect the data principles from, behavioral nudges or dark UX patterns that either the recipients or the custodians of data may subject data principles to. They are meant to notify from time to time the data principals as to where their data has gone, as to whether there is a recurring data fetch that is happening, and sensitizing customers to sort of periodically looking at it. Um, and they are meant to also now, circling back to my original sort of two-sided problem that I said, which is the risk of data privacy on the one hand and the risk of non-availability on the other because of a lot of inconvenient designs. They are also meant to be this sort of federated set of utilities who, on behalf of the data principals, will connect to all the 100 financial institutions, right? So instead of the customer having to go to net banking portals of, if I have 5 or 6 or 10 different financial accounts, and imagine if I've got to procure data to give to my financial advisor, let's say, I have to go to all of those 10 institutions. It's hugely inconvenient, and I may therefore end up not, doing that. But now if I can sort of delegate this to an agent of mine, it's like a concierge service, right? Who says, hey, you go on my behalf and you orchestrate, armed with my sort of electronic consent record, the flow of data between my sort of data custodians and my data fiduciaries. It is also taking care of the second half of the problem, which is the availability and the inconvenience issue is getting solved, right? So that's the second pillar that has been formed as a data governance measure, which is to license out a set of digital entities as NBFC account aggregators, who in many ways combine the front-end user interface responsibilities that a UPI third-party app does with the back-end switch responsibilities that maybe NPCI's switch does. And instead of a single switch for the country connecting to all the, to all the payment, issuers, here it is a bunch of federated entities that act as the institutions on behalf of something such data to then flow through those APIs to the data recipients that I as a customer would have given consent to, right? So that's sort of the second pillar. Let me just pause here to see if Anvesha, you would like to intervene, or should I go on with sort of laying out the rest of the data governance landscape here, or is there something I should be mindful of?
No, I think you can go ahead. I have a few questions, but I will ask them towards the end.
Okay, lovely. I'll probably take another 10 minutes and then we can pause and take some of those questions, and I can bring it home. No, so that's the second issue, right? So the first is that you've got a philosophy of standardized notices through a transparent digital interface designed by neutral entities, and a workflow that is supposed to be a single convenient workflow regardless of the types of financial accounts that I may give consent to, right? Now, outside of this is the mechanics of data in transit security, right? And so when we think about data governance, we are also thinking about risks such as, man-in-the-middle attacks, risks such as unwarranted third parties getting access to the data while it is on this highway, right? And, I think we've got to accept the fact that this entire architecture is, of course, predicated on one fundamental premise, and the premise is that data moves. And much can be said about whether in the future that premise itself will be sort of overturned, because there is a case to be made for a new architecture where data never moves, right? Where my data stays in the system of record that it was born in. And there is a way in which computation happens by, consented third parties with their algorithms moving to where the data is rather than the other way around, in a manner of speaking. And there are, concepts like confidential computing, etc., that are in that direction. But the account aggregator ecosystem is not based on that. I mean, that's for the future, and hopefully we will get this. Account aggregator is fundamentally based on data portability as a concept. The concept is that my data was born in one system of record, but it needs to travel to another system, right? And therefore, how do I ensure that this sort of courier service that we are building, how do we ensure that while the data is in transit, there are enough guards in place? Now, the good news is that the internet has already put in several basics there, right? I mean, the protocol that the internet itself is based on provides the first level of transport layer sort of guarantee, and applications such as the account aggregator are layered on top of HTTPS as a mechanism for transport. Second is that there are encryption mechanisms that are specific to the financial information, because that's the all-important sensitive PII that is going as the payload, through these digital highways, right? And so what the account aggregator ecosystem has spec'd out is a very specific algorithm that is popular in the communications world. Signal and WhatsApp and all of these have used what's called the Diffie-Hellman algorithm. And so when the spec came out, what the regulators did is they codified the Diffie-Hellman algorithm and specific parameters around it as a standard that all the custodians and the recipients have to implement. And what this algorithm guarantees is a couple of things. It guarantees that the sort of shared secret is only shareable by design between the recipient and the custodian, not even by the account aggregator in between. And so Diffie-Hellman is a classic example of how two entities that may be perfect strangers to each other can still collaborate in terms of sharing data in a manner where both of them share a secret, right? And that secret is shared in a manner where any the data is part information and all the financial information users have an implementation of the same algorithm to decrypt the data. The data blindness of the account aggregators here is important for me to mention, because what that really implies is that the account aggregators actually have no role to play in encrypting or decrypting the data. They have no role to play in even storing the data at their ends, although from a technical implementation standpoint, it is indeed a store and forward mechanism, which means that, it's like a courier boy going to my bank, picking up, the packet, which is sealed and signed, and I'll come to the signed part of it shortly. But it is sealed, it is signed, it is scrambled, in other words, encrypted. So to the extent that I then put it onto my scooter and then I sort of go to the data fiduciary to deliver it, I am storing it in my scooter. But that's only because I'm storing and forwarding it to the other party, right? And there are both, legal and audit guardrails that kick in to guarantee that the storage is time limited. And we've done a lot of work in our foundation to define such common codes of conduct, because there may be a wide variety of what if cases here, right? Which is, what if the data is never successfully delivered to the fiduciary, because in a digital transaction, so many things can go wrong. So how do you protect the customer from sort of an accidental storage not happening on any of the supposedly data blind account aggregator servers? And so there are legal and audit and technical codes of conduct that the ecosystem has layered to ensure that when certifications happen, these kinds of things are checked and guaranteed, for everyone. So that's sort of the second piece, right? So the first piece is transport layer security that is a function of internet protocols. The second is encryption for the financial information based on a very specific algorithm called Diffie-Hellman that allows strangers to share a shared secret. And it also offers what's called perfect forward secrecy, which is that this secret is generated for every conversation. So you and I having two different conversations at two different points in time, we'll never be able to use the same secret on those two conversations, right? So that's the second sort of mechanism. And the third mechanism is non-repudiation, which is when I, as a recipient, get finally the packet, granted it has come from a digital courier boy that I can trust because that courier boy is regulated by the regulator. I'm talking about the account aggregator here, but how do I know indeed that this data is born, from the servers of the bank, of the customer, and not from anywhere else? And that's where digital signature becomes the strategy, where whenever the custodian is giving the packet to the account aggregator, it is digitally signing that packet. And so if there is a grievance or there is a complaint about the data itself being altered, let's say the customer from a data governance standpoint challenges that, hey, this is not my data. I mean, this is not accurately representing my bank balance, for example. Now, how do you trace it back and ensure that what actually came to me was indeed what the bank gave? That's where the digital signature becomes a proof point, technically, to prevent such things from happening. And what do I mean by such things? Which is somebody altering the balance while it is in transit. How can you prevent that from happening? You prevent that from happening by ensuring that every payload is digitally signed using a combination of a private key, which by definition is private, with the signer, and a public key, which by definition is public. And I'm sure many of your folks know much more about this than I do. After all, it's Hasgeek, so there are enough geeks on this. But that's sort of the data in transit story, right? That protects data and governance. So therefore, the two parts, and I'll just say 2 more minutes on one risk that is still not addressed by design with the account aggregator ecosystem. But the two parts that are addressed is effectively consent instantiated as a digital workflow in a standard format with a neutral third party that always offers me a reliable consent management interface and a window or a dashboard that gives me the ability to exercise my right to know, right? Where has my data gone? When did it go? What happened to it, etc., etc. And it also protects me from vested interests from both my existing data custodians and my data fiduciaries. That's sort of story number one. Story number two is that the protocol, both in terms of the language being standard, in terms of the security mechanisms that are baked in, do guarantee a high degree of fraud resilience while data is in transit, which therefore mitigates, and I dare say prevents, the risk of data being altered, and that's a huge data governance sort of risk that we always carry in the digital front. But the third point, which is what does account aggregator not do? What it doesn't do by design is it doesn't take any responsibility for what happens to the data once the data lands inside the fiduciary's house. So it's like the courier boy says, look, I can do everything possible to safely transport the data and to always be your agent to instruct me on whether you want consent to be revoked on and what messages I should go. But once I deliver data, is the data fiduciary indeed limiting the usage of data to the stated purpose? Is the data fiduciary ensuring that on its servers, access controls and data at rest, protection measures and its own third party, sharing that it may do to its outsourced technology vendors or data processors? How is all of that, sort of taken care of? Of course, there are legal protections that all of these data fiduciaries are now subject to. Thanks to the DPDP, every entity, regardless of whether it is a financially regulated entity or otherwise, the moment it is seeking, data for what it thinks is a lawful purpose, it is bound to comply with the law. And the law therefore says that, of course, we are waiting for the rules to be published, but I'm speaking about the spirit of the law, which is that it says that, there is a right to erasure, a right to correction. There is a duty of care that data fiduciaries have to exercise while employing data processors and so on and so forth, right? So the good news is that there are legal protections. But does the account aggregator network extend its tentacles into providing insights to end users about whether those legal protections are being technically sort of implemented or guaranteed? The answer is no. The account aggregator ecosystem's job is to supply raw data to the environment where it will get processed. But after that, how does it get processed and what are the mechanisms to prevent and cure data privacy risks that may emanate from that environment is a completely different story. And of course, both Sahamati and several of us in the ecosystem are doing a lot of that. And, I'm sure that's where ethics by design and a lot of those concepts will now become more relevant, because the processing obviously now involves AI models, and that therefore goes into a whole different ballgame. Account aggregators do not, sort of try and solve that problem today. So that's a separate problem. Okay, lovely. So let me pause there. Thank you for giving me the space to ramble on, but questions now, and let's see where we land.
No, yeah, you actually answered a lot of the questions I had anyway. There's one question I have, which is, so given the difference in literacy and also digital literacy rates in India, how can the account aggregator and also the larger tech ecosystem ensure meaningful consent?
Yeah, that's really important and therefore tough problem to solve. I think there are two things that come to my mind. RBI a few months ago actually has sort of notified that the account aggregators have to ensure vernacular interfaces. And so one part of literacy is fundamentally, literal literacy, right? Which is, I will not know English, and the whole English tax concept that, design often suffers from. We are moving in the direction of mandating vernacular support. And so there is that sort of compliance guarantee that has kicked in now, where all the account aggregators who are consent managers have to ensure that they have to present consent in a language of choice. That's number one. Of course, there will be a whole plethora of optimizations there which will come in, but at least we've made a start, right, in terms of that. But the second literacy is really digital literacy, which is my ability to be comfortable with things like apps and websites and be very self-sufficient when it comes to digital literacy. And we all know that in India, self-sufficiency cannot be taken as sort of an assumption. So there is a lot of assisted mode, design that is required. Indeed, in the account aggregator ecosystem, funnily enough, the very first use case that some of the biggest banks have implemented is what they call a branch led or a relationship manager led use case, where it is not the end users that are expected to either access web apps or download apps. It's actually the apps that are employed or operated upon by branch personnel or relationship managers. And they are vocally and physically, educating customers about the whole concept and acting. So there is no real stress for customers themselves to understand this whole flow and all of that, which, by the way, is however, exactly what UPI has done. I mean, barring, of course, the whole QR code mechanism for me is, of course, making it very easy for me to fundamentally link my account and make a payment. The starting point in UPI is I have to download an app. Till date, if I don't know how to operate a Play Store and download an app, I cannot be on UPI. I mean, unless something has changed. I know UPI Lite has come out and then feature phone support, and that's a new concept relatively. It's perhaps a year old, but I'm talking about the large masses of the 300 million odd customers came on board or got in a very self-serve mode. Admittedly, even account aggregator, and for that matter, infrastructure in India, the earliest adopters are often the ones that perhaps don't need it the most. They are the urban, ones who are also the earliest adopters. They kick the tires of this and make it sort of robust. But the big banks have rolled out relationship manager or assisted mode things. The third sort of dimension to your question, Anvesha, is a question as a ticket to getting onboarded. What I mean by that is today, the identifier that is supposed to be necessary and sufficient is a SIM card, right? But that has consequences that may result in exclusion. We all know that SIM cards, and very recently, thankfully, RBI itself has come out. All of a month ago, RBI came out with sort of a guideline that soon they will come out with authentication framework, and they will not, allow SMS-based OTPs in the future. I mean, again, the rules have to come out, or more details have to come out, but this is the first indication of acknowledging that SMS-based OTP, which is fundamentally the authenticator attached to a SIM card as the sort of what I have mechanism of identifier, that is going to hopefully get strengthened, right? So you do have a problem of SIM card being fundamentally not very secure at scale, but you also have the problem of the mobile number itself not being persistent as a reliable identifier. I may change my mobile number, I may not change it in my bank account, or my Aadhaar number, may have my actual mobile number, but my bank account doesn't have my Aadhaar number, and so on. So one way to solve this exclusion is to dovetail a lot of these identifier related decisions into fundamentally Aadhaar as the identifier. And I think for good or for bad, and that's a separate discussion, there is a case to be made for making it somewhat central that if I have one identifier, I should be able to use that as a single ticket window to every financial service, which fundamentally means that that identifier is seeded in all the systems of record. And as we know, several systems have started progressing in that direction, making Aadhaar seeding sort of almost, required for me to have a seamless experience. I believe that that really is the last sort of solution in the trifecta that I just laid out. One is vernacular literacy, second is digital literacy, and the third is identifiers, seeding. The most common identifier being seeded in the largest repositories of data. When these three things happen, I think we will largely solve the problem of exclusion.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. I don't think we have any more questions for now. I'll just check. No. But yeah, anyway, we're almost at the end of our time. This was very insightful, and I think a lot of the questions that I had during the duration of your talk, you anyway answered eventually. So that was very helpful. And yeah, it was great to talk to you and learn more about data governance practices. If anyone else has questions while watching the recording later on, they will be shared on the comments under the project page, which then I'll forward to you, and then you can respond to at your own time. But with that, I think we're done for today. If you have any last thoughts or any comments you'd like to make, or any sort of learnings for developers who are actually building all these apps that and are questioning, privacy and ethics and data governance. Any sort of learnings for them, please do share, and then I think we can close the session.
No, no, I thank you again for the opportunity. I encourage those of you who are watching this to, of course, go to the Sahamati website for many resources that you may find useful in this context. But other than that, Anvesha, you know where to find me. We are connected on social media, and I would, through you, encourage all your friends, colleagues in this community to reach out to me if they need the more amplification of what I hope to share today. Very happy to engage separately with as many folks in the community that are practitioners of this and want to get their teeth really deep into this. Very happy to do that.
Thank you so much. With that, I think we'll close the session for today. Thank you so much, and I hope to have you again for a future session on a similar topic. Maybe seeing how things have evolved from now, and with all the tech policies and regulations that are coming in, what changes. That would be great. Thank you so much. We'll close the session now. Thank you.
Thank you.